dashing chap you see pictured here, briefing his men before a mission, is my grandfather. He was a wing commander in the Royal Air Force. Sadly, he was killed in action early in the Second World War. He left behind his wife, my grandmother, with very little money, no college education, no career, and 2 small girls to raise. The one in the middle is my mom. Knowing that she needed an income, my grandmother scraped together what little money she could, and she bought a fruit farm. The reason that the fruit farm was so cheap, location, location, location. It was right on the main route that the German bombers took to raid London every night. Between dodging bombs, my grandmother grew plums and apples to sell in the city during the growing season. But because the school fees and the bills didn't stop in the wintertime, she needed to find a source of revenue then. Remember, she didn't have a college degree or anything. She took out a pad of rationed paper, sat by the fireplace, and churned out a series of wartime best-selling novels under a pen name. So I think we can agree we're talking about a determined and pragmatic woman. Why, then, did all of my breakfasts with her involve splashing myself with sour milk? Well, this was the milk delivery system that my grandmother was used to. Pretty simple glass bottle, pretty intuitive foil top. This was the milk delivery system that came about in the 1970s when I was living with her. The full force of the German Air Force couldn't defeat my grandmother. This carton did. To the end of her days, she could never figure out how it worked. She would get frustrated, take out a big pair of kitchen shears, and chop the top off. Spills and spoilage were the result. My grandmother was not demonstrating what's known as mechanical sympathy. Now, mechanical sympathy is a wonderfully elegant term that refers to using an object, a designed object, in the way that it was intended. And if we use a designed object in the way that it was intended, we're likely to get the best performance out of it, and we're likely to get it to last a long time. Now, I'm sure like many of us, I know I have, I've tried to force something to get it to work in a way that it wasn't designed, only to break it. When if I just spent a little bit more time figuring out what the designer intended, might have saved myself a lot of grief. Now, I think that mechanical sympathy is a wonderful tool to help us make decisions about the most important mechanism of all, ourselves, our bodies, and our minds. And I think that if we do that, we might be able to get the best performance out of this mechanism and get it to last to its design specification, or at least as close to it as possible. It took a near-to-home, personal, human tragedy for me to really grasp this concept closely. I watched my mother-in-law, who is a very intelligent, very accomplished person, but one who had the standard American diet and was sedentary. I watched her spiral from obesity to diabetes to heart disease to dementia to cancer and ultimately death. And I watched her not be able to fully enjoy her grandchildren, and I watched the strain and the effort that this placed on my wife as her primary caregiver. And I said to myself, this is not going to happen to me. I am going to understand this mechanism and treat it with sympathy in order that I can enjoy my grandkids and that I won't be a burden to my wife or my daughter or anybody else who might have to look after me. Now, before I grasped this concept, I was more inclined to go with the popular theory of the day. So let's take my approach to exercise. I joined every sweaty boot camp class you can imagine. I haunted the Pilates halls of Chicago. I was a yogist. I pounded out mile after mile on hard concrete. What it got me were quite a lot of dirty laundry, hours and hours spent in the gym, and a painful trip to the knee surgeon. I hadn't done my research on the science of exercise, and I certainly wasn't being sympathetic to myself. So let's say we decide we're going to go on this journey together of really understanding the mechanism. Well, the good news is there's tons of information out there. The bad news is there's tons of information out there. And a lot of it is biased or uncurated, and you're going to have to do a bit of work to read the fine print. And this is particularly true in the field of nutrition. Are we super surprised when we read the fine print and we see that the study we're reading was commissioned by a major cereal manufacturer? That their conclusion is breakfast is the most important meal of the day. It's not. And that their product should play a central part. So understanding the mechanics broadly is a good idea. How about more specifically? How about testing ourselves to get a baseline? Good idea. But what kind of test? And how are we going to think about it? I'm going to guess that a large number of women in the audience have, with breast cancer concerns in mind, have gone for a mammogram. But I wonder how many of those same women have had the special kind of blood test that tells you what the particle count and particle size of your low-density lipoproteins are. It's not your typical LDL test. It's a special one. Why is that important? Well, according to the Center for Disease Control, women are 4 times more likely to die of a cardiac event than they are from breast cancer. So getting that testing element right is super important. So let's talk about how do we apply this in our daily lives. Let's start with eating. So my contention is that we've got to get our information on something as important as what we're putting into ourselves from sources that have really done the research and the science and who only have our best interest at heart, not some ulterior profit motive. So here are 3 books taken from my library that I think get to that end. I've learned an awful lot about the biomechanics of how my body processes food and some great information about what we should and shouldn't be eating from Dr. Kate Shanahan. I've learned an awful lot about the evolutionary design history of our whole mechanism from Nora Gedgaudas. And I've had the curtain pulled back on a lot of the shoddy science and manipulative work for profit that Nina Teicholz, who's an investigative journalist, writes about when she describes how a lot of the information sources that we've relied on for dietary advice, things like that food pyramid, have been badly distorted. Now, if you're more of an auditory learner, try listening to some of the interviews done by Dr. Rhonda Patrick. By the way, proof positive that you can have style and be a science geek. Or listen to some of the talks given by the equally stylish Dr. Sarah Hallberg, who in a super energetic but understandable way walks you through some of the wonderful hard science that she and some of her colleagues have been doing to prove what we should be eating. Spoiler alert, processed carbohydrates and sugars are not the fuel that we're designed to run on. So make your dinner plans and your lack of dessert plans accordingly. All right, how about exercise? We talked about that a little bit before. Do you need to be a marathon runner or spend hours and hours in the gym to be fit? Well, the good news is, if we actually study the mechanics of exercise, we can figure out that with just 15 to 20 minutes of exercise, once or twice a week, we can build strong bones and functionally strong muscles. The good news is, it really works. And it doesn't take a lot of time. The bad news is, it's actually a pretty hard 20 minutes, but it's worth it. All right, how about that most complicated tool of all, our brains? We have a brain that's evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to give us warning and advice and guidance in an environment that no longer exists. The modern world throws an entirely new level of stresses and problems at our poor old ancient brain. And many of us walk around absolutely absorbed by our thoughts, either regrets about the past or anxiety about the future. Breaking this mechanical connection between thoughts generated at random by our brains and ourselves is the key to ending a lot of our suffering, and it's the key to being able to enjoy the present moment. If we need to understand this from a mechanical perspective and to get some tips on how to do it, why not listen to people like Claire, people like Sharon Salzberg, Tara Brach, or Pema Chodron? I think this is a wonderful base from which to operate when you have that lack of suffering in your life. Let's close on a quick look at the other part of our equation, which is sympathy. Many of the women in my life show a frightening ability to ignore their own well-being when they're looking after other people. A close family member was recently diagnosed with a nasty form of cancer. She had seen the symptoms a year ago, but had pushed them off because she was so busy helping someone else in the family who was sick. Cancer is not a problem that does well being ignored, no matter how noble the cause. Airlines, I think, provide a nice little thing that we can remember. You've all seen the seat back pocket thing, and you've all had the airplane flight attendants show you how to use the oxygen mask. Then they say, put your mask on first before helping others. Perhaps we should really know how our figurative oxygen mask works. And let's put ours on first, because then I think we'll be in the best position to show up for those around us.